In 1791, Mozart wrote his opera The Magic Flute, which includes the famous aria for The Queen of the Night. It's what's known as a rage aria, sung in a mad fury by the villain of the opera. Hell's vengeance boils in my heart, she sings. But for the performer, the real villain is the sheet music, because it includes one of the highest notes ever written down, ever composed for the human voice. It's an F6, and on the piano it's high, but not that high. But for a soprano, it's incredibly, perilously high. Every time a soprano steps up to sing that passage, the audience holds its breath. It's the musical equivalent of a tightrope walk without a net. If she misses, everyone will know. Now, us modern classical composers often get a bad rap for our tendency to push things to the extremes. We use notes that sound like kettles boiling, whose main purpose is to make ears bleed and dogs confused. But actually, when it comes to high notes, composers have always done this. Check this out. This is from the early 1700s by the Italian composer Pietro Locatelli. And right here, the violin hits a C-sharp 8. That's literally off the end of the piano. Crazy high notes are obviously not essential to a great composition, but if even someone like Mozart can be seen playing with them, they must have some use. So let's look at some examples, see why they were written, and see if we can find any notes that are higher than that C-sharp 8. The surprising thing is that venturing into these stratospheres is rarely a pointless experiment by the composer. It's almost always motivated by some emotional or atmospheric goal. But yeah, okay, they do also write them to show off. That's exactly what Mozart and Locatelli were both doing. The F6 in Mozart's Queen of the Night showed off its star performer, but it wasn't actually the highest note Mozart wrote for the voice. He went one better in the much less well-known aria called Popoli di Tessaglia, hitting a G6. Interestingly, the singers who performed these two roles were sisters, and in fact sisters of Mozart's wife Constanza. I feel like there's a good joke in there somewhere. Please tell me what it is in the comments. For some years, the Guinness Book of Records had this G6 pegged as the highest musical note ever scored for the human voice. But if you're tempted to outdo Mozart, humans can very definitely sing higher. Here's French soprano Mado Robin hitting a spectacular and sustained B-flat 6. And of course, there's always Mariah Carey, who seems to be able to accurately find notes that are even higher than that. So if you think you can write something down and get a performer to accurately reproduce it, Mozart's record is eminently breakable. And more on that a bit later. One of the best known show-off composers was Paganini, who played his own violin compositions and was probably inspired by Locatelli 100 years before him. Paganini positively cultivated the image of a musical alchemist conjuring magical, impossible sounds from his instrument. And it worked. People genuinely thought he was in league with the devil himself. The fact that Paganini was both composer and performer, of course, helped a lot. Far easier to compose some risky high notes if you've tested them out at home first. That said, Paganini doesn't actually venture any higher than Locatelli. The highest note he wrote, as far as I know, is a C8. I'm not sure where this is heading, but it would be crazy if the highest note ever written was composed in like 1733. So much for all that 20th century innovation and extremism. There's no doubt that creating truly impressive or shocking new high notes on any instrument has become harder and harder to do. But it's still possible with little imagination. Only a few weeks ago I came across this amazing performance by the Greek clarinetist Petros Andreadis, which shocked me. A lot of notes that I never knew were remotely possible on the clarinet. I thought I'd written a high note for bass clarinet when I wrote a sounding E6 in my piece Gumboots. I've not seen a written note higher than E6 for the bass clarinet, and it is several notes higher than the notes that textbooks give for the bass clarinet's top note. But having heard Andriadis, I think I might have to reconsider. Attempting to write a note like this requires consulting with a player, unless of course you're Paganini and you can play it yourself. The performer at the premiere, Todd Palmer, told me initially that it wasn't playable, but then he phoned me back an hour or two later to say that with a different mouthpiece it was all fine. So why did I write such a crazy high note? Well, my reasons weren't to show off, they're an example of the second main reason that composers write extreme high notes: to create extremes of emotion. Sounding so high up, the note is difficult and strained even when played by the best players. The sound it makes has a yearning quality, a kind of wail full of tension. This is particularly powerful and effective on wind and brass instruments, where there's a genuine physical strain to create the note. Of course, this kind of tension is dependent on the instrument itself, so for example, a note just an octave above middle C will sound pretty ordinary on a flute, but on the bassoon it's at the very edge of its limit, so it sounds much more strained. I already talked about this in my video on register. Some instruments like, say, the piccolo are of course naturally very high, so a high note on a high instrument really is something visceral and primal. Shostakovich regularly uses the piccolo at the very top of its range, a high B-flat 8 or a C8, to create a musical version of a scream of anguish. But notice that that's still lower than Locatelli. And don't be fooled into thinking that extreme height always equals agony and pain. Just look at the jazz trumpet. If the textbook top note for a trumpet is a high C, Duke Ellington's scores, for example, regularly go to E flat or G or even higher. And the sound it makes is the opposite of agony, it's wild, exuberant joy. And joyful very high trumpets also make a regular appearance in Baroque music, like here in Bach's Brandenburg Concerto. If extremes of human emotion are a reason to write these ultra-high notes, another use is to suggest the supernatural. We've already seen hints of this in both Paganini's devilish approach and in Mozart's Queen of the Night. We talked about the Guinness World Record for the G6 for a composed note for voice. Well, that has now been surpassed by another composer who's using high notes to suggest the supernatural. Contemporary composer Thomas Addis started exploring the ultra-high voice in his opera The Tempest. In Shakespeare's play, Ariel is a magical spirit, and Addis gives her permanently stratospheric lines, written specially for the soprano Audrey Luna. This piece matches Mozart's top G6. In his next opera, The Exterminating Angel, he reaches one note higher, an A6, so a new record. Again, the opera deals with a strange supernatural force that affects all the characters and prevents them from leaving. But the top note itself is so short that one suspects it was at least partly written just for the headlines.
Opera singer recently broke records by singing the highest note in the history of the Metropolitan Opera.
So I want to give one more reason for composers choosing to write high notes, and that is to create a sense of fragility. Here's another example from my own work, my violin concerto Fragile Light, which uses a D8, which in this video at least is a new record. Higher than Shostakovich, higher than Paganini, higher even than Locatelli himself. Sorry, Pietro. But this time my goal in using the high note was fragility. My piece was inspired by the famous image taken by the Voyager spacecraft looking back at the Earth, the pale blue dot it's known as, the beautiful fragility of the Earth in the cold vast expanse of space. The final movement of the piece cycles around a melody in kind of spirals, like a spacecraft as it progresses further and further from the sun. I wanted to give the music a sense of it vanishing into the darkness of space. I kept pushing each cycle higher and higher, questioning as I wrote it how high I would dare to take it. I was writing this for the whole orchestral string section, so they all needed to be able to play it together. I couldn't actually find any examples of such super high notes, so it really was a bit of a gamble. But I eventually ended up with this final high note of a D8. Have a listen and see what you think, but I think the gamble paid off. It sounds kind of like a faint sigh, part human, part cosmic. But you might notice that it becomes very difficult to detect the actual pitch that's being played, and this seems to be something that comes from our own biology. A C8, the top note of the piano, is 4,186 Hz, and the human hearing range typically extends to around 15 or even 20,000 Hz. But studies in the 1970s showed that somewhere around the 4,000 to 5,000 mark, we stopped being able to detect the pitch of simple, pure tones. The traditional theory has been that our auditory nerves simply can't fire fast enough to keep up with the rapid waves of high-frequency sounds. But more recent studies suggest this isn't the whole story. If a sound is made up of a complex cluster of harmonics, listeners can still detect a clear pitch, even if all of those frequencies were well above 6,000 Hz. The suggestion is that our brains can bypass that natural speed limit by recognising the spatial pattern the sound makes inside the ear. I'm not an expert on all of this, of course, and I'd be curious to hear your own experiences. For example, here's a whole tune that's played above C8, and you might want to lock your dogs up before you play this. Now, you might be able to tell what tune it is, but can you tell what key it's in? I'll put the answer in the comments, but I can hear all sorts of apparent pitches in this that definitely aren't the ones that were played. Either way, perhaps there's still room beyond the end of the piano to make music. One composer who certainly thinks so is the contemporary Italian composer Salvatore Sciarrino. Sciarrino also makes fragile music, but of a different kind. This piece is called Capricci, so a bit of a nod to Paganini there. And much of it is played on harmonics, but he deliberately makes them quite hard to play, for example by using rapid bowing across the strings and very fast pace, so it makes the harmonics very difficult to sound out. On the page there are plenty of written notes that are higher than D8, here's a G-sharp 8 for example, but which of them will actually sound and how clearly they'll sound is uncertain, and it will probably change every performance. Sciarrino seems to be taking advantage of our ear's uncertainty above C8, and making his own kind of strange music here. I'm sure for some of you this will count as an example of that weirdness of contemporary music that we talked about, but it's a fascinating experiment and I think it makes for a fascinating listen. So I'm off to the States now for performances of my new wind quintet Natural Light with Camerata Pacifica, and I'll even be performing a small part with the ensemble on stage myself. There's no piccolo, so this is only going to go about as high as A6, so don't come expecting any really high notes. There are concerts in LA and Santa Barbara between the 1st and the 6th of March. I hope some of you will be able to make it, and do come and say hi if you do. And there should also be a video recording which I'll put up in due course. Sign up to my Patreon if you'd like to support the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
David Bruce.